nicely so that everyone can see me, even those, as usual, on the outside. The first thing we're going to do today is we're going to do what we haven't done for about 2 weeks now. For a second I wanted to say 2 years, but that would have been a bit too long. We're going to have a brief reading exercise, namely this time part or a sort of close reading of Lady Chatterley's Lover, namely this particular excerpt. So we're going to do that as we've done that in the beginning. So basically you read through that, talk to your neighbor, talk to the person sitting right next to you, but generally read through the excerpt. And because we have commented, or other people, not I, have commented so extensively on the body, I want you to read that with a focus on the body and with a focus on the importance of the body. It is partially about sexuality, so we're kind of drawing we're kind of drawing bodies back into the matter of sexuality, and I want you to simply read it, comment on the function of the body when it comes to sexuality. Again, you have 5 minutes for that, and then we'll get back together and talk about it. Are there any questions? First of all, that doesn't seem to be the case, then go for it. Okay, we're quietly approaching the 5-minute mark. Every one of you has read through the excerpt. All right, brilliant. So, commenting on the body. Of course, you know, there are 3 people that I could definitely ask, you know, when it comes to the body, but I'm not going to, so at least not now. Yeah, sorry about that. But generally, so reading through this excerpt, what does that tell us about the body? Or does it tell us anything about the body? Maybe, you know, the body isn't even in this excerpt. Maybe it's not even important. So what is the function and the role of the body within this particular, you know, kind of 5-minute reading exercise? Yes, please.
Maybe it's about how bodies age and you will have a mind.
Yeah. Which part? Kind of would you go, where does aging play or do play a role?
Maybe like as the years drew on it, the fear of nothingness and the life that affected her. Like you see in the beginning there, apparently in the beginning it was all fine and dandy. Then like it became more and more like nothingness.
Yeah. So this is something that people on the outside will not see, my awful handwriting. I'm just kind of collecting first. Okay, so age and decay generally. What else? Yes?
And there's the sentence, sexually, they were passionless, even dead. So this is a huge factor when it comes to their relationship. So you get the feeling that Connie is truly, how do you say that? So she wants to have a better relationship with Clifford, but so his disability is kind of behind them to have a better relationship maybe.
Yeah, so his disability is certainly a part where that makes both of them sort of sexually passionless, even dead. Even though, you know, it's described throughout the book that they have an intellectually rich relationship in some form, but everything else, everything that has to do with the body is, of course, not really working as it should or as it was before. Yeah, absolutely. What else? Why is it so hard to comment on the body in this particular excerpt? That was a partially raised hand. I saw that. Yes, please.
Because she never mentions it directly, she always mentions the opposite, so the mental life, the intellect.
Yeah?
And she kind of, I think for me the metaphor, for example, with the sofa cushions is like that you have something real and you take it apart and then it has no meaning anymore.
Yeah?
Because you can over-analyze things and then passion is gone or something like that.
That is one way of putting, so if you overthink it in a way. Also, they are very much focused on these intellectual pursuits. There are a number of descriptions where they debate, where they discuss things, but it's very much this sort of not very physical relationship, both between their friends as well as between Connie and Clifford. Yes?
Then one more thing, like for example with the money, that they say if we see also the money as a physical, well it is physical, the object of the money, and then it moves on to success, and again from body to mind.
Yeah. I'm just putting it out as success, money and resources, because we'll get to that. There was another, yeah.
I think it reveals a kind of distant view on the body, because she talks about success, money, resources, age and everything, and also about this intellectual life, or the book talks about, but there is no real mentioning of physical things, and it seems as if she cannot relate the physical world to what happens in her world. It all means nothing to her, so the question is what means something to her.
Yeah. Absolutely. So there's this view of the body from the outside, not really. There seems to be this weird disconnect, especially with Connie in the beginning, that the body is there. It's, you know, a material thing. She loses weight. She's pale. She's described in bodily terms. She's a sturdy-looking woman. But then again, the body seems to fade into the background. And I think there's this is it Lady Bennet, I believe? She basically tells her, you know, we'd be much happier if we could sort of forget about our bodies. And we'll get to that in a moment, because this is a very interesting class connection that we see within the book, in particular when it comes to bodies. What else about the body within this? Does not seem to be the case. Anything else that you know, found striking, weird, commentable? Yes?
Something to go maybe a tiny bit against what we were saying, because suddenly the fame that she calls nothing takes physical form in the busts of people, for example, in galleries.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how that would connect, but it sounds like it's in contrast with the rest of the text at times, a tiny bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So you have certain forms of success that are measured in physical objects. So physicality is certainly a part of the novel in general, a part of this excerpt. You have, for instance, rugby is it itself always described as physically intimidating as well, etc., etc. So physicality is a part of it, that's true. Maybe the group that talked about bodies last week, anything you can comment on, anything we didn't really address as of yet, anything you would like to add? No? Maybe because, Michelle, I believe you did the... Yeah, sorry about that. Now I know at least your 3 names, so that's good for you, for me in this case, maybe not so good for you. But you talked about the theoretical approaches to bodily or to materiality in a way, right? Maybe a comment from you. Do you think that we see a particular approach to bodies as a theoretical approach to bodies within the novel or within this excerpt?
It's not really talking about it in this excerpt, like, it's not really like she said, I'm sorry, I don't know the name. She said it's not really, they don't really address it like in many other like excerpts that we showed us, they describe her shell or not theoretical.
Yeah, absolutely. Does that change throughout the book? Not just question for you, but question for everyone. Does that view of bodies as this sort of material outside that is absolutely disconnect from the mind, does that change throughout the book? Is there a particular moment where it changes? Yes?
When Connie has the affair with Mellors, she starts like thinking about her body. First of all, she views herself in the mirror, and then she even likes when he gives compliment about her body and how it is formed. And then she starts seeing her body as a part of her and not like a view from the outside, but she's very happy to have that body, and that Mellors in that case like that body.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
I think she also discovers that she can make use of her body, and that her body is, well, a part of her which is really salient to her life. And so she makes a connection to the body, and also finds meaning for it.
Yeah, absolutely. She kind of, it sounds weird to say, but she kind of rediscovers her body or the importance of her body, because she rediscovers that materiality which is completely absent within the halls of rugby in a way, because, you know, Clifford is so much, I mean, he's very much linked to machines. He's always fiddling with his radio, but generally he's also very much linked to intellectual pursuits. So he writes, he has pictures taken of him, he has paintings. There's always this idea of art, but very disembodied art. And this is something that changes throughout the book, namely, as you so rightly said, after she engages in that affair with the gamekeeper, and she sort of rediscovers the body as a site for pleasure on the one hand, but body as a material entity that she can make use of as on the other hand. And this is sort of exactly what we're going to briefly trace, namely the importance of bodies in general. So there will be some kind of theory again, because when we talk about class, the body will come in handy again. So I'm going to take a bit, I'm going to take a bit away from class or the discussion about class. But we'll also sort of kind of briefly examine how D.H. Lawrence tries to bring body and mind back together, because what he observes is, in general, that there is this disconnect, and that disconnect isn't healthy for humans. So he argues in favor of sort of pushing that back together, of bridging this gap between mind and body. And this is very briefly what we'll go through. Maybe a question not so much related to Lady Chatterley's lover and more related to what we sort of set up last week. Why do we need to talk about bodies? And I mean, we've mentioned parts of it, but I just want to sort of, sum it up very briefly before we go on. Why is it important to talk about bodies in general, not just, with regard to sexuality or with regard to Lady Chatterley's lover? That's a very personal thing, why do you think it's important to talk about bodies? Or maybe, why do you think it's not? That's also, potential. Michael?
Maybe because it matters, especially.
Oh, yes!
especially like in our society, I think there's more that thinking about us as a whole society, not that individualistic and
Yeah. So bodies as an expression of individualism. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Also connected to what I talked about last week with regarding body positivity and body neutrality. All of us have bodies,
Mm-hmm.
therefore we should talk about them, especially because not talking about it and like shaming our bodies often linked to medical reasons being overlooked, or
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if we're talking specifically about sex and sexuality, so like getting pregnant, STDs, abortions,
Yep.
they're also very relevant topics nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely. You also talked about age every time, if you're getting 30, for instance, people will generally start to comment about, oh, you're 30, so first grey hair, these things, suddenly age becomes literally a matter that you ought to talk about at some point. So bodies do age, they do change, there are able bodies, disabled bodies, etc., etc. Yes. Why else should we talk about bodies? Or why shouldn't we? Yes.
I think it's also important to know what your body is telling you, like listening to your body and to your gut.
Very good point. Mm-hmm.
Or if someone is doing sports or something, just to know when the limit is reached and you shouldn't go further, or that you can still push yourself on the other side, so that you just know what your body is trying to tell you.
It's a good point that you said, listen to your gut. That's, I think, very prevalent saying that, and we'll get to that in a moment. You raised your hand, then you in the, I don't know the names, that's really, I should ask you to put on your name tag, and then I can go and squint at it and at least know your names. And then last but not least, I think Michelle and you, whom I am staring at. Oh, I'm so sorry, really. Usually I know the names, but this semester I don't. So we'll go basically, not clockwise, but we'll start in the front.
In my case, the name is Katarina.
Yes. All right. I know. Okay. Mm-hmm.
I have 2 points which come to my mind when we are thinking about bodies.
Yep.
First, that bodies in general are the physical frame and limit and ability of life, so that all we can do, all we can say, think, where we can walk, all we can do is just related to our body, because the body enables us to do things.
Mm-hmm.
Also
Yep.
limits us to not be able to do things.
Yep.
And so the body is of major importance, and this is a point where everything else we said about listening to our body, sports and everything
Mm-hmm.
relates. And the other point which came to mind was that the body in our society is really a place of display and individualization and expression. So people really express themselves throughout their body, and this also related to the society discourse about body positivity, what is beauty, who am I with connection to my body, which with regard to performativity maybe.
I'm still listening.
Okay, that's where the question.
Yeah, very good points. There's the question. I mean, Connie also says it, right? There is some sort of display going on, not just with for a second I want to say intelligent life, but that sounds a bit alien. But usually also with our bodies. We do things to our bodies. I have tattoos not because of some spiritual reason, but of course because I want to show these things off. You don't get a tattoo in a very visible place and then have it covered for the entire time, unless of course you're in an environment that doesn't want you to show that. But generally there is with bodies in general, there is some sort of display involved and some sort of as you said, expression, and I've just added performance because we'll get into that in a moment. You had raised your hand. Yeah, all right. At the end of the semester I'll know at least 4 names or so.
I think it was mentioned kind of, so I'm not sure if this is something new that I can say, but I mean, in our culture we judge people a lot on how the body looks. We have racism and sexism, and I mean, I think that alone that we create categories in our heads and judge people on how they look, even if we don't mean to sometimes, because it's ingrained in us. I think that alone is important to.
Absolutely. Bodies are, I think Kathleen Woodward calls it the markers of social difference in many ways, from age to gender to race to, there are loads of things where you can immediately pinpoint whom you perceive someone to be. So I think, because going back to the question with tattoos, I think one of the best questions I've ever got asked was, are you a criminal because you've got tattoos? And I'm like, last I checked I wasn't, but if you get those questions you might become one. But generally these are immediately conceived notions you have in your head if someone presents a certain way. Undine, please. You had raised your hand.
This was basically already said, because like bodies are all around us, like we cannot live without a body, so like at least not to my knowledge, so I guess we have to make do with what we have and learn about it, so it's important because it's everywhere.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, and Michelle.
And I think also society tells us a lot about bodies, especially now, like in America with the abortion laws and everything. I watched it yesterday and I was literally fuming, because I think it's not okay to tell a woman, as a man, to tell a woman what she should do, because all the Senate people are like men who say that abortion should be illegal after 6 weeks, I think.
Yeah. We're right at the point where basically no one knows that she's pregnant.
Yeah. So I think that the man, not everything against men, but men.
Not all men, but men.
That's something very feminist. I think that sounds so mean against men. So, but I mean, I think it's not okay to tell anyone what to do with the body, especially something medical like abortion or something like that.
Am I going to open that can of worms with abortion? Difficult. But yes, usually most issues, or a lot of issues, especially when it comes to procreation, when it comes to abortion, when it comes to female bodies in general, is, well, very much connected to bodies. So medical issues are certainly part of it. So I would agree that this is a bit of a problem there. I'm not going to get into that abortion debate because, academic rants are okay, but going on about more political issues might not be the right place. Anyways, Hannah.
Remind me of something. The whole question has to do with that. Interesting, because it came to my mind. I was doing research on my presentation topic. I actually came across, if you don't know the concept of body farms, and they gave us.
Do you mean body farms as in dead people?
Yes.
All right, cool. Oh, wow, sorry. That's
and the person said for those who don't know,
Yeah.
lay corpses out to dry in the sun or get.
Yeah. They also bury them.
Animals just to like explore how bodies decompose, and
Mhm.
they actually said, one of the workers there said that we should start looking at a body as like, how am I supposed to say it? That we should stop looking at a human being for their body, but like as their soul. So we should disconnect the soul from the body. And I thought this really interesting because he said something along the lines of that when we start to look at a person.
Mhm.
Wenn wir halt uns die Person anschauen und sagen, okay, die Person gehört zu dem Körper, fangen wir an, das emotional zu sehen, the job. So we have to disconnect the two. I don't know how to explain it, but it was super interesting. I'm so sorry for speaking.
I like those side notes. I mean, every time you talk about dead people, I'm totally on board, which is a very weird thing to say.
Yeah, you cannot work with dead
Yeah.
people for that long without having to separate the two, because
Yeah.
otherwise you would cry every time you see a dead person.
Yeah. That's actually a very good point. Those body farms are super interesting. I mean, they have nothing to do with sexuality. That's also a very, you know, moving on. Wow, it's Monday. All right. But you said something quite interesting, because you noted the soul and questions of emotion. Like, we need to see bodies as generally always human beings, as in having some kind of soul, having some kind of mind, there is a personality, etc., etc. So there are a couple of theoretical notions. Some people say bodies are just that, they're material shells, and we have, yes, Michelle.
Also, like you said, soul and emotions, like animals or plants also have bodies, so thinking about emotions.
But they don't have a soul. They're not humans, so they don't matter.
So it's okay, further and masses.
Yeah. No, it's a very good point, because especially when we talk about human bodies, we have one huge problem in a way. And that problem is, where does our personality rest? And and here I'm going to go sort of back and forth for a bit, because usually if we talk about bodies, we immediately say, you know what, that's maybe not, that's not really the source of our humanity. So that's our shell and we use it, but it's like a costume, something you have been given and something you perform in. But generally, if we talk about self and if we talk about humans, we also think that mind and soul are somehow a bit more important, because the body is something you use, but you know, the mind is something you train, something that changes, something that makes you you. And the body is a part of that, but it's not exactly a significant part, at least if you look at, you know, identity construction in general. Because if we talk about identity construction, we always talk about some kind of transcendental soul, something that makes us irrevocably us, that changes and that grows, but that is essentially us. And this is has had a very long tradition of mind and soul and mind and body, and it's called the Cartesian mind and body split. So in our society and Western societies in general, we separate body from mind / from soul. Because, you know, the body has been seen as the origin of sin. It's you know, the flesh that decays. That's, you know, something we have been given, we have to work with, and we have to work within its limits, but it enables us also. But generally, the important part of us is our mind, is our soul. And this is sort of where Lady Chatterley's Lava, coming back to that, sort of makes a different notion, because it says, you know, we can't separate the two. And this has been a bit of a problem if you look at you know, people aging. And I think if you have older people, you've certainly heard things like, you know, older body, but she's still young inside, right? And this is exactly where this Cartesian mind and body split is useful, but where it gets problematic, because it separates one from the other, but we can't separate that. That's all a very weirdly theoretical thing, because, you know, people knew that the body eventually decays, you eventually die, but people are very much afraid of death, you know, unless you have someone who says, you know what, I want to be on a body farm after that. So there's that. But generally, we are literally mortally afraid of death. So there needs to be something that goes on. We need, that sounds like Gollum. We need to hold on to something. But generally, we need to hold on, need to hold on to something, and that is usually where the body, where the soul comes in. This is time transcendent. This is something that passes on. There's an afterlife where bodies don't matter, but where our souls can rest. And these ideas of the importance of the soul and the not quite as important part of the body, this is something that we see in our identity construction all the time, except for the moments where you have things like, a gut feeling, where we trust our gut and we trust our bodies, our instincts to know whether someone is trustworthy or whether we like someone, etc., etc. But the Cartesian mind and body split is one of the sort of significant and central points of constructions of bodies. This is why we have social constructivism of the body, where the body is either there or it's not, etc., etc. But generally, we can separate sort of theories of materiality of bodies into two larger ideas. One is corporeality. Corporeality is simply the material basis you have, everything that makes up your body. This is simply the flesh that decays, that has all instincts, hunger, thirst, whatever. This is the body, this is corporeality, the material basis of everything you do. And then there's embodiment. And you've said that already. So corporeality would be enabling limiting. Can I walk? How far can I walk? How's my condition? Etc., etc. That's corporeality. Expression and performance, this is where embodiment is actually a vital or significant part, because embodiment is what we do with our bodies. Bodies are generally a medium. What is inside, personality can be expressed through the body. And this is performance, expression, and embodiment. So when we talk about bodies, we need to separate between the material basis of these bodies and what we do with them, how we act through bodies, by bodies, etc., etc. So are these two terms, I'm not quite sure what I'm doing. It's a very Trump-like thing to do. But exactly that. But is it clear what I mean with embodiment and corporeality and how that ties in or back in with identity? If it's not clear, just tell me and I'm going to try and explain. Okay, good. Okay, moving on from corporeality and embodiment, because this is more or less what we need to think about in theory before we start talking about bodies. And what I'm going to do now is sort of go through a particular way of talking about bodies. So I said that in the beginning, and I'm going to switch on the projector. Bodies are significant if we talk about class. And of course, class, that should come as no surprise, is a huge part of Lady Chatterley's Lover. Lady Chatterley's Lover is very much about class. And within the book, we have different body types that are associated with different classes. We have different forms and levels of fitness, basically, being associated with particular classes. So bodies are incredibly significant if we talk about class. Now, the question to you, how comfortable, not comfortable, but how well known or knowledgeable are you about class and the importance of bodies when it comes to class? Could you comment on it generally? Yes, Undine?
So like back in the ages, like Middle Ages,
yeah.
I would say, it was more a rich person thing to be like have a heavy body to weigh more because it symbolizes wealth, and then that you are able to buy a lot of food.
Mm-hmm.
And also that when you have pale skin, it would mean that you don't have to do any hard labor outside, but that you could spend your time inside and be pale, not see the sun and stuff. And now it's more like if you have a fat body, then like you're not as much worth because you're not attractive, and that meaning you're worthless, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. This is why, oh, brilliant, I switched it on and now you can't read anything I wrote down. Brilliant. This is why I wrote down success, money, and resources. Resources in general, as you've so rightly said, that what you've basically said about, you know, times before, that's still the same nowadays, of course. Access to resources, to certain forms of capital, whether it's economic in the sense of money, whether it's social in the sense of family networks, you know, friend groups, etc., whether it's cultural capital. I'm not going to go into the terms too much. Like the things you surround yourselves with, you know, it's a difference if you wear, I don't know, Louis Vuitton, or if you wear TK Maxx, I don't know, the cheapest thing you can get. That's a difference, not only of excess, but also of, I think Bourdieu calls it to be able to appreciate it, you know, to have a certain taste. So money, resources, that is vital when it comes to the construction of our bodies and construction of bodies in general. So your access to healthcare certainly influences the type of body you have, how you can, you know, move your body, you know, what limits and enables you in this case. Also, access to or I don't know, other forms of capital, the clothes you wear, the makeup you wear, if you have any body modification being done to you. This is always dependent on the resources you have or the resources your family has. Also, as I said, in terms of education and in terms of appreciation of certain body types. So there's one, I think, Michelle, you might have stumbled across him. He's called Chris Schilling. He's a sociologist and he talks quite a bit, or writes a bit on, yes, oh God, indeed. He writes quite a bit on bodies, and which I find very problematic, we should be careful with it, but he says that working class bodies have worse access to healthcare, so their bodies aren't as healthy in general. Also, they favor certain body types far more than middle classes, for instance, or the aristocracy or upper classes. And he basically says, you know, working class bodies or the working class have a certain relationship to their bodies, and that is the body as a machine. Something that has to work, something that has to function, but it doesn't have to be healthy, it just needs to work for their purpose. In the purpose, for instance, working in a factory, it doesn't matter how healthy you are, you just need to be able enough to do your work. That's not so much the case for middle classes. They want to have enhancement of their bodies. Foucault calls that the techniques or technologies of self, basically something that you do with dieting, with I think someone calls it potions, but it generally is things like makeup, creams, etc., etc. Everything that you use in order to modify your body, to make it better, to make it more attractive. So also resource, I've said something about cultural resources, economic, social, etc., but also there's symbolic capital, symbolic resources. Am I attractive? If I'm attractive, I'll probably get further than someone who isn't. And attractiveness is, of course, you know, always in the eye of the beholder, but generally there are certain attractiveness standards or certain standards for how people ought to look like in a society that very much influence how far people get, how far they have access to resources, to money, to success, for instance. So Clifford, for instance, in the book is always described as broad and blonde and very beautiful in a way. His success might be much easier than if he were Mellor, whom I always kind of imagined as a Hagrid lookalike. I mean, that might not be, you know, they don't have the same resources and the same setup in the beginning, but they also might not have or be able to lay the same claim to success and to fame, you know, simply because of the way they look like and the way they, or where they do come from. And I'm going to switch that on, because talking about class, there are, and I think I also have that on the slide, but I might have already summed it up more or less. That's something we'll get to later on. But generally, resources, capital in general, that's what Bourdieu calls it, and I think you might have heard of that already generally. He says that capital generally exists in the embodied form, in the objectified form, and in the institutional form or institutionalized form. I'm not going to read out the quote. What we are focusing on is the embodied state, namely in the form of long-lasting dispositions of the mind and the body, while the objectified state are things like things you possess. You know, if you have a painting or original painting of some famous painter, that is objectified cultural capital. Or if you have if you have a master's degree and you have that hanging on your wall, then you have a legally sanctioned sort of form of institutionalized cultural capital in the form of education. So these are sort of the resources you use in your daily life, and that is not dependent so much on class generally. But again, we're going to focus on the embodied state in general. So embodied class is basically that we perform, and this is where we get back to the performance, we perform class, we perform certain, as he calls it, certain dispositions of the mind. And this is something he calls habitus. And weirdly enough, Bourdieu, so I'm talking about Pierre Bourdieu in this case, he makes the differentiation between hexes, that is just the material basis, the way you walk, you talk, etc., etc. And then he says, but there's also habitus, that is something you are being trained in, basically. I think a couple of semesters ago, one of my favorite examples was, if you ever see a Ralph Fiennes film, look at the way he stands, look at the way he talks and he walks, because he does this very strange thing where he stands like this, his elbows outside and his hands really weirdly next to his thighs. And this is not something that is particular, you know, just something that Ralph Fiennes does, but that has also something to do with the way he was raised, the way he was trained as a child. So these things, posture, the way you walk, the way you talk, the way you eat, these things are not only cultural questions, but these things are very much class questions. And this is where the body, of course, is quite important, because we train our corporal shell to do certain things and to perform certain actions. And usually people with the same class background will roughly perform the same way. So it's going back, you know, historically, there's a sociologist who is called Norbert Elias. You might have not heard of him. It doesn't matter, but he basically says that class questions and body questions sort of develop throughout the ages. And he brings the example of whether we use cutlery, how we use cutlery, what kinds of cutlery we use. So do we use spoons or do we use knives and forks? And that is a sort of very strange process, because, you know, upper classes used to sort of have one big knife and then maybe a fork, but generally a spoon, and that sort of trickled down and trickled up. So there are certain top-bottom processes that happen with the training of the so-called civilized body, and this is something we still do. There's always around bodies a question of policing and a question of enabling things. So even nowadays there are certain things that are permitted to do to bodies and with bodies, and then there are things that are socially policed. If you have someone who has black work being done on him and has certain really weird body modifications, then these people will be socially sanctioned. They might not have access to certain jobs. They might not have access to certain spaces. They might be looked at really weirdly if they go to the opera. These things still work nowadays, but they're very much class dependent, because someone, and I'm of course oversimplifying, someone of an upper class background will probably not have his entire or her entire body being tattooed very black, so that probably won't happen. But generally we can see where someone comes from just by the way they behave and the way they act sort of in a social environment. I think I have a lot of quotes, which I'm, yes?
But isn't the body also changing if you like have a certain job or something, like that you, I don't know, if you do some jobs and you have lots of people around you who might be in upper class than you are, then you might change your body as well, or especially if you think about jobs like, I don't know, being a prostitute or something, then you also change your body. So
upper class, prostitution.
Sorry, I know
Yep.
difference is huge, but still, it's, you do a job, you might come from upper class, then you think, I like sex, I want to be a squat lady, or I don't know, and then you change your body to be more successful, and there are also people who have good jobs and then change their bodies because they see how the others behave and look like.
Yes, I'm just going to switch that off because I know that I probably won't use any of these quotes. I'm just going to explain it like this. Okay, what you said, changing your... Yes, Michelle?
But I also think there's something of what you said, also something that's not conscious, because I heard if you're the president of America, that you age faster than like, you age faster and these like years you will be president.
That's also what they say if you're a teacher. You are... No, sorry.
So I heard that and I found it funny, and then they showed pictures of Obama before and after his perceive, which black doesn't crack, but still.
I know what you're getting at. I think maybe that's you said that you touched upon that. There is something in between. So habitus, what I said, the ways you talk and walk and all of these things, the ways you gesture, this is basically right between the mind and the body. There are certain things. So the body. So personal example, for instance, my grandmother was usually really concerned that my posture was bad, so she always corrected me, and everyone goes like, oh, sorry. So, she always went on, you need to sit up straight, don't slouch, don't do this, don't do that, etc., etc. So this is sort of a childhood training of the body, something she probably did quite consciously, but I sort of corrected quite unconsciously. So this is something you're being trained to. So there's some kind of socialization going on, where you're trained, where you're corrected, where you have to do certain things, wear certain clothes, behave in a certain way. There are also things you do consciously. So this is something you choose later on, for instance, where you decide to modify things, for instance. But generally, habitus, in a way, is something you do. It's not always consciously. It's usually something you do unknowingly and unconsciously, but not in the sense of you're not aware that you're doing it, but in the sense of you can't really explain why you do these things. Yes?
Yeah, I read that in the article that you said I should read, so I thought that's very fun because I did not grow up with my grandpa, but my dad said I walk like my grandpa.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Even though also your grandpa is very nice for saying it, just my mom just slapped me in the back and said, stand straight.
That's a very not so nice way of correcting posture, but yeah, sometimes I don't want to call it genetically because it's not quite clear how habitus is formed, but usually it's some kind of mimicking. You mimic people right around you, your grandparents, your parents, your brothers, your sisters, etc., etc. You kind of accumulate these things in this habitus, but you don't do that automatically or thinkingly. You don't look at someone and go, you know what, I'm going to walk like my father for the rest of my life. I certainly didn't do that, and I still do. So generally, this happens, but I think, or in this case, that's something that is sort of a translation. This is a medium. So basically you have the sender-receiver model, and the habitus is the message. So this is something that makes us socially intelligible. If I talk a certain way, again, an example I did when I first started to study, ages and ages ago, I did a presentation, first presentation in university, and I was really excited, and I talked, and the professor was happy with it. He actually called me in the front and said, you know what, I really liked your presentation, but, and I thought, oh God, whatever you did, maybe you rambled on like I do now. But what he actually said was, and I'm going to do that in German because that stuck with me for a lot of years. And he said, es ist zwar schön, was Sie gemacht haben, aber wenn Sie jemand an der Uni ernst nehmen will, dann sollten Sie nicht klingen, als würden Sie aus dem sächsischen Hinterland kommen. And you're standing there and you go, I've received a hurt. Oh, wow. And I have no idea how I sounded. I mean, I do know because there are, fun things you did in school and someone filmed you and you go like, this is not me. I don't know who that is. Looks like me. It doesn't talk like me. Anyways, but what I did is I immediately started to correct the way I spoke. So I tried to train myself out of a dialect. And this is something that in academia happens quite often, that people are trained out of something. Not only because someone tells you you sound like a bumbling idiot, but also because sometimes people speak differently than you, because academia or universities is this sort of melting pot of different people from different regions in Germany or from different regions in general. So you try to sort of mimic that. You try to sort of tone down dialects, unless you're of course in a group that is very dialect heavy. But generally, people tend to talk very differently, not because of choice, but sometimes simply because other people do it, and you start to mimic them. You start to mimic other dialects, etc., etc. So these processes are not always conscious. They can be, but they don't have to be. And sometimes things that happen in your mind influence, your habitus, you start to change that, and that changes the way you act, the way your body does things in society. So, for instance, gesturing. Someone told me I gesture too much when I teach. I still do it. But if I had taken on that piece of advice, I would have probably started to kind of make that smaller, not gesture. You start to change the things your body does. And habitus is simply the translating point. This is what happens through education, through socialization, your personality. All of these things that happen inside you are being translated by the habitus to bodily actions. And this is simply a way of translating these processes to someone else, make it intelligible, make it understandable for someone else. Because if I talk a certain way, if I eat a certain way, people will probably quite easily know what class I'm from, what background I'm from, etc., etc. If I still spoke the way I did when I was 18, you would probably instantly, and I mean, you still notice that I'm obviously somewhere from Saxony, because you can hear it. And this is something you can only hardly, I mean, you can change it, but that's more of a conscious process. If you really want to change things, your body does. Okay, have I confused anyone or everyone or no one? Okay. You do know what habitus is now, or at least you're not like, heard of it, but can't explain? Okay. Because coming back to, that's also a very interesting note. Coming back to what sort of, why am I, it's Monday evening, honestly. But coming back to Lady Chatterley's lover. I've said that in the beginning, and if we go back to the quote, which I'm not going to do right now, but what Lady Chatterley's lover, and as I've said in the beginning, what it tries to do is to bridge that gap in order to kind of still have the habitus in there, have it translate Connie's inner state, for instance, or Clifford's inner state. He's always described as the perfect gentleman, even after he has his disability, he still described, so the habitus is still important, but more importantly, what the novel does and what the novel seeks to do is to bring the body back into the question, because as Michelle has said last week, for the longest time the object of study in sociology wasn't the body, because the body wasn't really important. And the novel tries to sort of work against this sort of weird mind and body split that we see in Western societies. Generally, how it does that is that it re-establishes the body as this medium to make actions socially, on the one hand, intelligible, but also it brings, and I think Lawrence describes that in his apropos of Lady Chatterley's lover, he sort of describes it as sort of the body as the structural element of aliveness. And this is where sexuality comes back into focus, because sexuality, and I think I can actually show you that one quote at least. He says that the body and not the mind, even though his protagonists are very much intellectuals, what he notes is that that's not important. What's important is indeed their bodies, because let me briefly go back. No, not that. Yes. So what his idea of the body and the mind, not only that it needs to be brought back into focus together, the connection is important, but he says that the body's life is the life of sensations and emotions. The body feels real hunger, real thirst, real joy in the sun or the snow, real pleasure in the smell of roses or the look of a lilac bush, real anger, real sorrow, real love, real tenderness, real warmth, real passion, real hate, real grief. All emotions belong to the body and are only recognized by the mind. How different they are, mental feelings and real feelings. And this is sort of the stance he, in a way, implicitly, and it's, I know the author is dead, but this is obviously something he wants to, in a way, argue within his novel, that the mind isn't important. Clifford might look good, but his mind is feeble. He is connected, or he's very much dehumanized. He is the spineless worm that wriggles. He is an animal in a way. It's very, very dehumanizing how he is described within the novel. His body might be is disabled. So there's also the weird connection between a disabled body and a sort of disabled mind, which I find very problematic. While, of course, you know, Connie is first described as healthy. She has a healthy sex life. Suddenly, Clifford and she don't. She gets pale. She is healthy. She unhealthy. She's sickly. Then she gets back, or she gets into this affair with Malor, and suddenly she's healthy again. So there's always the idea: the moment you bring the body back into play, the moment you can feel real love, real tenderness, real warmth. That sounds like an advertisement. The moment you are able to reconnect to your material basis, so to speak, that's the moment where you become healthy, where you become whole in a way. And it's a very essentialist and very problematic view, but generally that is one of the stances that the book proposes, that the moment there is some disability, either mentally or physically, the entire thing, this sort of balance between mind and body is offset and doesn't really work any longer and needs to be restored. And this is, of course, you know, something that Malor can do for Connie, restore this sort of balance and bring body and mind back together. Do you have any comments so far? Okay, that is brilliant. Because then I would sort of go on, because when we talk about relationships and Connie and her, for a second I want to say her numerous lovers, it's 3 potentially, if not the Germans in the beginning. We're going to move on to marriage and love and intimacy, and I think we'll be talking mostly about marriage in the beginning. And I'm going to hand over the microphone to you in a moment and switch everything. You already know the setting up process. So you can still see yourself right here and your presentation,
yeah.
But also you can use that and, you know, to
forward.
You know what I mean.
Yeah.
I don't know what I mean, obviously. All right.
I would just try my best.
Just try. If it works, if it does, brilliant. If it doesn't,
not brilliant.
Then it doesn't. Not brilliant. Just try it for a second.
Huh?
Can you?
Oh.
Ah, yeah, brilliant. That seems to work.
Great.
Cool.
Okay.
And now we can go.
Okay. So, hello everyone. Not to my late night show, but to my presentation about marriage in Lady Chatterley's Lover compared to today's Western marriages. Here you can see my contents, and before I continue, I just want you to know that when it comes to the point 5, so differences to Western marriages, that I will just like briefly sum up the differences, because otherwise we would run out of time. So I will talk about it in general and not specifically, and I don't think I have to give you a disclaimer that I might talk about sex. So, okay. Just some general information about Lady Chatterley's Lover. It was written by D.H. Lawrence. As you know, it was first published in a limited edition in Florence in 1928, and the first full version was published over 30 years later in New York in 1959. And just in case you haven't read the book, I will give you a short summary because you have to know what it is about. So the book is about a married upper-class couple, Clifford and Connie Chatterley, and they're only married properly for 1 month, and after that Clifford has to go to war. When he comes back, he's paralyzed from the waist down, and he dreams of becoming a famous writer. Connie, on the other hand, his wife, is longing for a mutual connection, which includes sex. She does not have with Clifford, and during the book their connection seems to fade away, and after disappointing affair with the playwright Michaelis, Connie has an affair with the estate's gamekeeper Oliver Malor. Okay. And who fulfills all her wishes, which includes the mutual connection, but also the sexual connection. Before I continue, I want to know from you what you think of when you hear marriage in the 1928. What comes to your mind? You might refer to social constructions, the importance of sex and love, or any other subject you want to refer to. So what do you think of when you hear marriage in 1928? Yeah.
Well, the obvious for me is a heterosexual couple. Yeah, like a man and a woman. The woman is probably a bit younger than the man. And yeah, they marry quite early, like 20s to 30s. That's probably a bit late, but like something like that. And yeah, they will probably have 1 or 2 kids, and that's basically what comes to mind.
Yeah.
Okay. I also think maybe the thing will that she forgot. Sorry.
Okay, somebody else. Yeah.
Traditional gender roles, housewife and a man who provides.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe that all that age difference is more socially accepted in today's, or today's more critically reviewed than back then.
Yeah, good idea.
I would say basically marriage had a really other status than nowadays because it was normal to be married, and especially women sought to find a husband. Men sought to have a beautiful woman who could give them children. I think procreation also was very important back then. Yeah, and I also think, as you can see maybe in the picture, that the woman also always was very, very devoted to her man, while he was just the father of the house and he made the decisions. And I think there also were differences between upper class and lower classes because, well, okay, this is from the Renaissance lecture in cultural studies, but I think it also comes into play in 1928 when in the lower classes or working class backgrounds, women also had to do things because they had really more responsibilities, whereas in upper class they really, okay, they had their children, but they had nannies for the children and they could just spend their lives on, yeah, intellectual life, more or less.
Okay. Remembered?
Yeah, now I remember everything like sex before marriage is bad, that the woman of course should go into the marriage as a virgin. Maybe not especially the man is not, I think, required to be a virgin, but the woman of course should be a virgin, and they're at least a boy.
Okay, so thank you very much for your answers. I also had some thoughts, some are just like the same as yours, but some are also different. So I also thought about heterosexual marriages. And what I thought about when I thought about the differences of upper class and lower class was that the wife for the upper class was supposed to produce like an heir who can go on with the traditions, and in the lower class they just needed the children to help and to support, to give money, to do the household, etc. Then I also thought about the fact that one was not supposed to marry someone who was not in their own class. Love was only secondary. I think all of your answers somehow related to that. And to the sex part, I thought that sex was just for producing a child. So more or less what you said, and it was only fun for the man or most of the time, and the contraception methods were not really there or not affordable for a lot of families. So when I was looking up some facts who could I could use. I found that excerpt from Bodies, Sexuality and the Modernization of the British Working Class, 1920s to 1960s, written by Stephen Broke. And it said Mrs. F was used as a typical example of a working class mother, age 34, 18 pregnancies, refuses coitus with her husband until he overpowers her, has asked him to take other women during last pregnancies, has done everything she knew to pursue an abortion. In such discourses, a good husband was often equated with one who left his wife alone sexually. A bad husband was unable to control his apparently brutish desires. So there are a lot of things I thought about that quote. First of all, we have the 18 pregnancies. So that is a working class mother. So just like we said, the difference between upper class and lower class. Obviously, in the upper class, it wasn't the case, but it's a typical example for working class. Then what I also find very striking is that in such discourses, a good husband was equated with one who left his wife alone sexually. Like, if you haven't had sex, you couldn't have sexual interaction. There's no foreplay, there are no handjobs, no oral sex, I don't know. You just can't have any sex at all, or you get pregnant again as a wife, obviously. So yeah, I thought that this was quite surprising, but also shocking. And then to continue, we have the housewife picture. So married women were expected to devote themselves to running the household, raising children, acquiesce to the husband's judgment. I don't know who of you mentioned that, but some of you said that, especially the like just nodding whatever your husband is saying and agreeing, yes, you're right. So that was very typical. Women were expected to consider themselves lucky for just having been married. Then one should remain in his or her class. Here we have again the class struggle. Because of the First World War, there was like a little change upcoming. It was not yet developed finally, but emotional compatibility and sexual enjoyment as important conditions for happy relationship were becoming more important, and all that was built on trust. That progress was not being done in 1928, but it was an upcoming progress, which is why I put it in here. And one often remained in his or her relationship for safety reasons, but not because of love, because you had the money, it was convenient, so you just stayed together. So now to the divorce. First of all, I was quite surprised that divorce was even possible back then, to be honest, because I have never thought about divorce in 1920 or 1930. But the options were like very, there were only a few options given. So we had a few legal resources or options for women who were stuck in abusive relationships. Divorces were allowed only in special situations, such as adultery, but even then, exceptions were made. For example, in cases of bigamy or impotence, couples often wished to have a divorce, but then they had to present their cases to the court. That's what I wanted to say, and to provide proof for the partner's infidelity or wrongdoing. So you just couldn't go there and say, hey, I don't know, I just can't smell my husband anymore, or I don't like my wife anymore, she's quite annoying. That did not work. You really needed the proof if you wanted to divorce. And if the divorce finally happened, women, of course, had fewer rights and had to prove that they weren't insane if they wanted to gain custody of their children. Because why did her husband divorce her? Oh. Okay. If they weren't insane. Okay. And often a divorced woman was left with very few resources. So now we will talk about marriage in Lady Chatterley's Lover, or more specifically about Clifford and Connie. Just beforehand, I won't read out every quote, but if you just want to know why I came up with that conclusions, I have put lots of quotes beneath them, but we don't have the time to read out all quotes.
Oh, we do have the time.
You do? Okay. Then I will just read out every quote. So, first of all, Connie and Clifford came from different backgrounds, which was quite progressive for the time back then. They both were upper class, but Clifford was seen as more upper class than Connie. Then, from the very beginning onwards, Clifford was dependent on Connie, and he needed her because he had an anxiety towards lower classes, and Connie seemed to him very independent, very mistress of herself, and he needed her to deal with such situations where he had to, I don't know, talk or see people from lower classes. To continue, their connection seems mutual and pure, especially in the beginning. We just said earlier today that they had that intellectual relationship, and in the beginning that seems like, yeah, maybe even like love when you start to read the book, because you're like, wow, they're really connected. How can that happen in that age in 1928? That's crazy. So Clifford was a virgin until they married, and he says, or the book says, that their intimacy was beyond a man's satisfaction and beyond sex. So they did not need to have sex to have their connection, which was on an intellectual basis. Then, even though Clifford and Connie had have servants, Clifford still depends on Connie, and she must fulfill some of housewife duties. For example, she has to bring him tea, she has to eat dinner with him, I think, at 7:30 or something. So he just needs her to be there, because then he feels like he exists at all. So that's what it says. He needed Connie to be there to assure him he existed at all. Then what is shown repeatedly in the book is that Connie and Clifford do not really speak to or trust each other, not on an intellectual basis. They have those debates, but on more like an emotional basis. There are lots of passages where Connie just thinks something and the reader reads what she thinks, and then it's like she does not tell Clifford because, I don't know, he will get upset, or she just doesn't want to tell him, or she does not see him, or she's annoyed by him, and the other way around. So they often have those intellectual debates, but about other stuff they're not really talking. I think, yeah, I choose an example where she was afraid that Clifford would get angry, so she just didn't say what she thought at all. They have lots of routines together, which makes the living together very convenient. And even when Michaelis wanted to marry Connie, she's like, not really, Clifford still needs me, and she was like still stuck with him and still needed all those routines. The sex part of the marriage is missing, obviously, as Clifford is paralyzed, and that causes Connie lots of psychic troubles over the time being, especially when she doesn't have the affair. We just touched upon that earlier. She says, I'm not well lately, I don't know what's the matter with me. As the reader, you know it's because she's missing that sex thing. She doesn't have the affair anymore, and she needs sex to feel good again. Another reason why Connie is upset is because she cannot have a child, and she really wants to have a family. That becomes obvious after she has visited Mrs. Flint, because after that she's a bit jealous that she cannot have that child. And she also talks about having a child with Clifford, and Clifford talks about having a child with her. And they say, okay, let's have a child. Or Clifford has the idea of, hey, Connie, don't you want to have a child? Because he wants an heir for rugby who can continue their traditions. And she wants to be a mother. And he trusts her judgment when it comes to that. He's like, I know you will choose the right guy and we will have a great child. And it doesn't matter to me when I bring him up, or him up, I think it's most of the time a him, then he will be a great heir. No one has to know, we can tell everyone it's my child, and that will be fine, as long as Connie promises to stay with him. It doesn't matter to him, he doesn't want to know who the father is, as long as Connie says, I will stay with you. And there's one passage where he even wanted Connie to swear that she will stay, because he was so afraid of losing her, and of not having her with him, because for the social associations he still needed Connie. He needed her to be with him. So then Connie gets pregnant from her affair with Mellor, the gamekeeper, but she also fell in love with Mellor, which is a huge problem because now she wants to leave Clifford and she wants a divorce, which Clifford refuses to give to her. She even says, "Hey, I'm pregnant from the gamekeeper," which Clifford wouldn't approve, as Mellor is from a lower class and he doesn't like the lower classes. But it doesn't work the way she wanted, and Clifford refuses to divorce from her, but not because he is in love with her or I don't know, but he wants her as his property. He needs her for his own reassurance, and he even says, "I shall never divorce you because I follow my own inclination and I'm not inclined to." So it's all about him. I follow my own inclination. In the end, Connie just left Clifford, even though they're not divorced, and she lives with her sister, and it looks like there will be a happy end. We cannot say for sure, but it looks like that, and that she then can live with Mellor and have that real mutual and sexual connection, which is quite progressive, that she's like, "I will leave you." Because as we had, what we said in the beginning was that lots of people stayed together because it was so convenient, and she still was like, "No, I want Mellor, I'm in love with him, and I will leave you." So now, last but not least, the differences to Western marriages today. Lots of people remain single. It's not atypical. I think also one of you said that when I was asking you about what you think of when you hear marriage in 1928. Less people marry in general, and lots of couples do not have children at all or very late. That also includes married couples. In general, people talk about sex more openly, and it is common to have sex with a potential partner before having a relationship or before marrying. Not everyone is doing that, but in general, it's not. You don't have to marry someone after you had sex with him or her because you're afraid of having a child. There are methods today like the anti-baby pill, you can use condoms, and it's affordable for everyone. Many people also divorce and remarry because the partner's permission is not needed anymore. You can just go to court and say, "Hey, I don't like my partner anymore, I don't like how he or she smells, and I want to divorce," and that's fine. And last but not least, people are supporting marriage for all. There are lots of countries who try to make it legal for homosexual couples to marry, and there are lots of trends going for marriage for all. And before I finish, I wanted to know from you if you have any other ideas which differences can be seen between marriage in 1928, or especially between marriage and Lady Chatterley's lover and marriage today, if you know any other differences. Doesn't look that way. Yeah, okay then. Here are my sources.
Yeah, maybe today there's also a little push to polyamorous relationships. So maybe they could have, like the lady Chatterley talked about, maybe have a relationship between those three people.
True.
Probably not realistic considering how Clifford is, but theoretically they could have. But yeah, today I think it's also possible to have like not two parents, but like three or four or more, or different constellations of how the relationship works.
True. I totally forgot that, but yeah, true. Yeah.
I would say that there is much a difference, but I think that in general the discourse became bigger. There are still people who believe in, well, maybe not exactly the same idea of marriage like 1928, but people have very strict ideas about it and have other norms than other people's. So there are many ideas about marriage in play right now, and it also is really dependent on the cultural background and on
Yeah, that's why I was focusing on Western marriages. But yeah, true, there are different backgrounds, but in general, there are like several pictures you see of marriage and not that one picture of a wife and a husband.
There is no this idea of marriage nowadays anymore.
Yeah. True. Yeah. Okay. Any other comments? Yeah?
I do have a question.
Okay.
And that is not just a question to you, but generally, to everyone. You said that there will be a happy ending in the end of it, or there might be a potential happy ending. That happy ending, just to clarify, would be that she marries Milo and that she divorces from Clifford, right?
Yeah, so happy end for Connie.
Okay, that's a very good point, because, and you said that, we usually equate marriage with love, or, love is not only the sort of the founding basis for marriage, but if you're in love, marriage is the sort of foregone conclusion, right?
Yeah.
Right. My question would be, isn't actually Connie's marriage to Clifford the better way? She can have her affairs, she can get everything she wants from him, she is financially secure, etc., etc. Because I would very much doubt that we have this very strange idea of marriage and love being always together, and it needs to be together, and even in a marriage of love there isn't any convenience that eventually sort of starts to crop up at some point, and I'm not quite sure, I don't ask for your relationship status, but if you've been together for 10 plus years.
Yeah, that's also what Hilda said to Connie, like, you will get bored and you won't like him anymore. So
I mean, we don't need to go into that direction,
but,
right?
But still, she did not approve of Connie and Malor, especially in the beginning when she first heard of it. And yeah, it would absolutely more convenient for Connie to stay with Clifford, but her feelings are in her way and she's so in love, like head in the clouds. Yeah, absolutely. Maybe even for the first time for a long, long time, and Malor makes her feel like Clifford. I'm not sure if Clifford ever made her feel that way. And if he did, it's a long time ago, so she probably forgot that.
Question is, does he need her?
Yeah, for Connie, I think he does. Otherwise, she wouldn't go that direction, I suppose.
It's with how she treats Mela. It's a very strange mirroring of what Michaelis does to her.
Yeah.
It's very much putting her on this pedestal, which he does in retrospect also with the gamekeeper in this case. The thing is just, we need to be a bit careful to link marriage and love in that way, because that's a very 20th century white Western kind of idea of marriage and love. We have this sort of white wedding culture where marriage is, or the wedding itself, is the pinnacle of your life, especially if you're a woman, you need to marry and your day needs to look exactly the way you've always imagined. And this is problematic, and we are reading this book very much from exactly this standpoint of a very certain wedding marriage culture. So in some way we need to be careful to say that this is a happy ending for Connie. It is, marriage is always brought up. Clifford wants to marry her. I think one of the Germans wants to marry her.
Yeah.
Michaelis wants to marry her. Everyone wants to marry her. Everyone wants to marry, because marriage at that point is the only way for women to socially advance to some point and to be secure, because they can't inherit, they can't have a job. However, this changes in the 1920s, because what you said was very correct, no question, but the Second World War, because men came back, they were traumatized. Impotence was a huge problem simply because of PTSD or shell shock at that point. Women were very much more, not masculine, but they were very starting to become far more, also political actors. We have the voting rights in the 1920s, suffragette movements, etc., etc. So this changes. We don't have the sort of weirdly Victorian idea of the angel of the house any longer, except for, well, in the upper classes. And Connie is in a way middle class, so she has this possibility, the potential to move between the classes. Yes.
Is it okay to think of this idea of a happy ending, that Connie marries Mellors and they are happily ever after. Is it good to think of this as reminiscent of the idea of the author that body and mind in unity is always the better choice? Because in this moment she chooses her emotions and that she is healthy and in unity with herself again over what she had with Clifford, and so this is maybe the ending that is triggered.
That's a very good point. I would probably say that she neither chooses the right husband, neither Clifford nor Mellor is the right one, because Mellor is very much, you know, the body kind of guy. Clifford is mostly the intellectual, where she can have, you know, her very class-related debates. You know, that's not something she can do with Mellor. And I think the last words he writes in his letter to her is, I think, Sir Thomas greets Lady Jane. I mean, they call their genitals like that. Yeah, you know, you do you. But he's very much connected to this question of the body is important. He is literally the center point for Connie and her bodily awakening, whereas Clifford is the same for her mental, intellectual awakening. So I would argue that she chooses the wrong guy twice over, in a way. Because neither of them sort of brings together body and mind. Maybe Michaelis actually does in retrospect the most, because he tries at least. Yeah. But generally, I would argue that it's very problematic generally but that's a good point, generally.
So when I was like checking the facts for the presentation, I also read on some website that the end is like looking for a happy ending, and I also thought that way, but yeah, I see your point as well. But I think that's also what one has to consider is how you yourself picture a happy ending or a perfect relationship or whatever. So that's probably, it also has to be taken into account.
Yeah, very good. Also class way. I mean, Mellors is not middle class. It's not quite sure how happy she'll be in being not in a middle class environment. So that's very up for grabs in this case.
Yeah, sometimes it's difficult to read what he's saying when the dialect is written down.
Absolutely. Yeah. But I can already hear people moving their chairs. I'd say we're done for this week. Thank you very much for your presentation. And we're going to be talking about marriage very briefly next week before we move on to our next topic, that is, I believe, gender. But I'm going to see you next week. Have a good week. Next session, indeed. Next week there's Whitsun first. So you actually have a day or a week off.
Vielen Dank.